The bells across London rang out in the crisp October air, their jubilant clamor reverberating across the River Thames. Inside the royal suites of Richmond Palace, King Henry VIII stood by the cradle of his infant son, his large frame shaking with a victory 2 decades in the making. Edward Tudor, a healthy, crying boy, was the kingdom's deliverance at last. The king's hands, still dark with ink from signing the notice of the prince's birth, hovered over the child, as if to protect him from the very air. "The Lord has heard my prayers," Henry whispered, his voice heavy with emotion. The lines on his face, made hard by years of fury and disappointment, eased for the first time in ages. Outside, the celebrations were already underway, with bonfires illuminating the night, their flames reaching the sky in defiance of the autumn cold. Wine was poured freely in the streets, and merchants gave out bread to the poor, everything paid for by the royal treasury. The realm, long perched on the verge of uncertainty, breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Tudor dynasty would continue. Yet underneath the jubilation, the risks were incredibly high. Henry's fixation on producing a male successor had reshaped the whole of England. Queens cast aside, the church was fractured, treaties were broken. 2 of his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, had been branded as bastards in his relentless quest. The shadow of civil war had loomed with every passing year, every stillborn child, every failed conception. Now at 52, the monarch had his prince. Jane Seymour, wan but tranquil in her birthing bed, observed her husband with weary satisfaction. She had accomplished what Catherine and had not. "He seems strong, Your Grace," she murmured, although the midwives had already seen the baby's slight build, the delicate wrists too slender for a future monarch. Henry hardly noticed her. His thoughts raced with ideas: Edward's schooling, his marriage, the appointment of loyal counselors. The boy would require armor made by his 3rd year, and swords by his 5th. He would be the ideal prince, the warrior King England so deserved. A courtier coughed gently. "The Archbishop is waiting to conduct the christening, Your Grace," Henry agreed, but his eyes never left his son. "Let the realm see him," he ordered. "Let them understand England's future is safe." As the infant was taken to the chapel wrapped in golden cloth, the king permitted himself a rare, genuine smile. The specters of his failures, the sons lost before their first breath, the women who had carried them, were finally quieted. But in the shadows, the physicians shared a look. The infant's cries, though loud, were too short, his breathing unsteady. They said nothing. Not on this day. Today was for the king's triumph. And so, Edward VI came into the world cradled by hope and wrapped in danger. The royal nursery at Richmond was a bastion of velvet and caution. No breeze was allowed to pass through the tapestries. No person came in without a complete inspection. Edward Tudor, England's treasured prince, rested in a gilded cradle, his every respiration checked by a rotation of nurses whose hands were scrubbed raw with vinegar and rosemary. From the moment he was born, rumors crept through the palace like a winter fog. The infant was small, too tiny for a monarch's son. His limbs were slender as twigs. His skin was so pale that the blue veins beneath pulsed like tiny rivers. The midwives, experienced in the births of noble children, had paused before announcing him robust. "A fragile constitution," one whispered, and that phrase attached itself to Edward like another baptism. Henry VIII, on his visits, waved away such worries with a flick of his jeweled hand. "All infants are frail initially," he boomed, though his knuckles whitened on the cradle's edge, as if to steady his nerves. "He will grow stronger. He has to." But the king's appearances were short, his patience limited. The nursery's heavy quietness unnerved him. The quiet voices, the scent of medicinal herbs, so thick it was stifling. It was better to leave the child to the women and doctors, to their unending rituals of defense. Edward's days were a structured ballet of carefulness. His milk was checked for poison before every feeding. His swaddling clothes were changed each hour to prevent any dampness from affecting his lungs. Even the air he took in was passed through fabrics soaked in rose water, in case some foul miasma entered. Another cover for His Highness, directed Lady Bryan, the lead nurse, her tone sharp with command, and see that the fire gives off no smoke. The court doctors, men of great repute and questionable cures, prescribed tonics of powdered pearls and gold flakes, promising the king they would strengthen the royal humors. Jane Seymour, still weak from her delivery, worried from her rooms. "Is he taking his food well?" she inquired each time her ladies brought an update. Inside the nursery, the candles burned down and the shadows grew long. The physicians talked of humors and balances, of omens and portents, and Edward, cradled in velvet and fear, breathed. The court's dedication to Prince Edward was a display of extravagance, a golden cage designed to hide his frailty. Every desire of the infant prince was met before it could become a cry. Servants hovered around him like moths to a light, their actions precise, their voices low. Yet for all the luxury, the velvet-lined bassinet, the toys of carved ivory, the physician's presence was most prominent, their dark robes rustling with the gravity of the king's order. "A further tincture, your majesty," whispered Dr. Owens, his fingers stained yellow from handling endless herbs. He poured a vial of dark fluid between Edward's lips. The prince's face twisted from the bitter taste. The potion, a mixture of powdered stag's horn and pale wine, was intended to fortify the blood. Edward coughed, his small form shaking, but the doctor simply nodded, satisfied. "See his resistance? It is a sign of his strength." Lady Bryan's lips tightened as she cleaned the prince's chin with a linen square. She had cared for Henry's other offspring, had seen how royal babies prospered with rougher play and open air. But Edward was swaddled in quiet, his universe confined to his nursery's four walls and the endless work of men who viewed his body as a contest of humors and stars. "Perhaps less medicine and more sunlight," she suggested one morning, daring to look at Dr. Fenton, the newest and most zealous of Edward's caregivers. The man's laugh was sharp. "And risk the prince catching a chill? The king would have our heads." He took Edward's wrist, placing fingers on the weak pulse. "The planetary positions are not favorable this month. Mars is dominant. It inflames the lungs. We have to purge the excess heat." Then followed the purges, doses of rhubarb and hellebore that left Edward weak and crying. The leeches came after, placed on his pale flesh to remove corrupted bile. The prince's wails were muffled in the fabric of his nurse's skirts, lest the noise disturb the courtiers waiting outside the chamber. Henry, during his visits, saw only what he wanted to see. "His complexion improves," he announced one evening, though Edward's cheeks were red from fever, not health. The king's hand, heavy with gemstones, cupped his son's head. A tutor through and through. The physicians repeated the sentiment, their voices a unified chant. "Indeed, your grace, a very robust constitution. The treatments are working." Only Edward's half-sister, Mary, sneaking into the nursery on her rare visits, dared to put a cool hand on his brow. "He is burning," she whispered to Lady Bryan. The nurse paused, then bent to rearrange the prince's blankets. "All infants run hot." My Lady Mary's eyes, far too old for her 17 years, showed doubt, but she spoke no more. To doubt the prince's treatment was to doubt the king's judgment. And so the pretense went on. The court scribes wrote glowing reports of Edward's development. The ambassadors reported news of England's healthy air. The gold-threaded gowns he wore for his monthly public viewings concealed the thinness of his arms and legs. Behind closed doors, the doctors argued in Latin, their voices low and urgent. They bled him when a moon was waning, fed him roasted peacock when it was waxing. Every failure was met with a new hypothesis, a more complex cure. Edward, trapped in the storm of their anxiety, grew ever quieter. His laugh, once a bright sound in the suffocating nursery, vanished into silence. He observed the world with serious eyes, as if he already knew the cruel paradox of his life. The more they tried to make him strong, the weaker he became. The kingdom, unaware, celebrated its prince. The physicians noted each cough, each feverish night, in books that would never see the king's desk. And the nursery, with all its splendor, smelled more and more of blood and bitter medicine. By the time Edward was 6, the nursery was replaced by the schoolroom, a place of inky fingers and constant examination. The prince's learning was a state affair, managed by a group of tutors, chosen by Henry himself. Every morning, before the palace was fully awake, Edward was woken from his sleep, his small body lost in the stiff brocade of his doublet. "Again, Your Highness," intoned Dr. Richard Cox, tapping his knuckles on the oak desk. The tutor's beard bristled with impatience as he indicated the Latin conjugation written on the parchment. Amo, amas, amat. Edward's fingers shook as he followed the letters. The candlelight flickered, throwing unstable shadows on the page. Amo, amas, he said, his voice just above a whisper. Louder, my prince. A monarch's voice must command. Edward swallowed, his throat parched. He had already said the verbs a dozen times, but Dr. Cox's expectations were as firm as his father's. He took a breath and tried once more. Amo, amas, amat. A cough cut him off, sharp and abrupt. He put a hand to his chest, his face turning red with the effort. Dr. Cox sighed, his quill making a note in his ledger's margin. We will stop for your physic. A servant appeared with a cup of honeyed wine infused with powdered pearl, another of the physician's remedies to strengthen the lungs. Edward drank it obediently, though the sweetness clung to his tongue like glue. He loathed the taste, loathed how it made his stomach clench, but defiance was not an option. By mid-morning, the schoolroom filled with more teachers. Mr. Cheek came to drill him in Greek, his voice lilting while reciting passages from Herodotus. Edward's translations were quick and accurate, too accurate, some said. His intellect was a sharp sword, but his physique fell behind. While other boys his age were practicing with bows in the courtyards, Edward was kept with his books, his limbs considered too fragile for exertion. Your Highness excels in matters of theology, observed Archbishop Cranmer during a weekly visit. He smiled as Edward read a difficult passage from Erasmus, his small hands deftly handling the pages of the large Bible. A most devout prince. Edward nodded, but his eyes wandered to the window, where the faint shouts of stable hands drifted up. The sun painted the lawns in gold, and he imagined for a moment running on the grass, free from tutors or potions. The vision was broken as Dr. Fenton swept in, his satchel of cures clinking forebodingly. Time for your Highness's midday treatment. The prince's shoulders drooped, but he offered no resistance. The leeches were first placed on the inside of his arms to rebalance the humors, followed by foul-smelling poultices strapped to his chest with linen strips. Edward endured it all quietly, his jaw set tight against the discomfort. Such strength, murmured Lady Bryan, her fingers touching his damp brow. Edward didn't speak. Complaints were for common boys, not for future kings. By evening, after the last tutor had gone, the prince was allowed a brief respite. He would sit near the fire, his thin legs swinging from the oversized chair, and draw maps of imagined wars in his notebooks. Sometimes, if the coughing wasn't bad, he would hum a melody his mother had sung, a memory so distant it could have been imagined. But even these small freedoms were short-lived. The physicians would come back, their expressions serious, their hands holding new cures. The tutors would show up at sunrise with new scrolls and higher standards. And Henry, during his visits, would slap his son on the back with paternal pride. "See how he prospers," the king exclaimed to the Spanish ambassador one evening, unaware of the dark rings under Edward's eyes. A scholar and a leader in the making, the ambassador bowed, his eyes lingering for a second too long on the prince's paleness. "Indeed, your majesty." A very impressive child. Edward, standing rigid at his father's side, forced a smile. That night, as the palace slept, he huddled under his blankets, his body sore from the day's ordeals. The candle at his bedside sputtered, its flame dying in wax. In the quiet darkness, he allowed himself a single, small, shuddering breath, unmonitored, uncriticized. Then he shut his eyes, and the crown's weight pressed down on him again. The fever arrived without any warning. One second, Edward was reading Psalms under the keen eye of Archbishop Cranmer, his voice clear despite a dull ache in his head. The next, the words on the page blurred, the letters swirling like dark motes of dust. A surge of heat washed over him, so powerful he gasped. "Your Highness!" Cranmer's hand reached out to steady him as the prince wobbled in his seat. Edward blinked, his sight narrowing. The room, so well known with its oak-paneled walls and latticed windows, seemed to be tilting. I am fine," he managed, but the words were slurred, his tongue feeling heavy. Then the coughing began. It ripped through him like a wild animal, shaking his small frame with such force that his ribs ached in protest. Each spasm was wet and ragged, scraping his throat raw. When he finally could draw a breath, the flavor of copper filled his mouth. The archbishop's face lost all its color. He pulled a handkerchief from his sleeve and held it to Edward's mouth. When he moved it away, the fabric was flecked with crimson. The room burst into frantic activity. Cranmer shouted for the physicians. Servants scurried like frightened rabbits. Somewhere in the chaos, Edward recognized the frantic sound of the alarm bell, a noise kept for royal emergencies. Yet, as hands lifted him from his seat, as the first cold cloth was placed on his brow, Edward's mind fixed on a single, awful thought. This felt different. The previous fevers had been short, passing annoyances put out by bed rest and tonics. This one clung to his bones like pitch. The cough was no longer the dry, irritating thing of winter drafts. It was deep, voracious. By the time the royal doctors arrived, their dark robes flapping like ravens' wings, the prince was shivering under a pile of blankets, his skin damp with sweat. Dr. Owens pushed his way to the bed, his nostrils flaring at the cloying, sweet smell of infection. "How long has His Highness been like this?" "Less than an hour," Cranmer replied, his voice strained. But Edward, slipping in and out of consciousness, knew the truth. The weariness had been growing for weeks, the headaches, the way his breath caught when he climbed the palace steps. He hadn't said anything, naturally. A tutor does not show weakness. The physicians descended like a murder of crows, their diagnoses overlapping. An imbalance of the humors, malignant airs from the Thames, Mars in retrograde, inflaming the pulmonary, leeches were called for. A poultice of crushed garlic and mustard seed was applied to Edward's chest, burning through his night clothes. Someone bled him. The lancet's sting was sharp in the fever's haze. The bowl filled alarmingly fast. Through it all, a single phrase slithered among the courtiers gathered at the doorway. Like his uncle, Prince Arthur, Henry's older brother, had coughed himself into an early grave at 15. The whispers got to the king within the hour. Henry entered like a tempest, his presence filling the chamber as the physicians rushed to bow. "What is the meaning of all this?" his voice thundered. But Edward, delirious with fever, saw the quick flicker of panic in his father's eyes. Dr. Fenton stepped forward, oozing false confidence. "A passing ague, Your Majesty. The prince is quite strong." Henry grabbed the physician's arm, his fingers digging into the man's sleeve. "You said the last fever was a trifle, and the one before that." His gaze went to Edward, who lay limp on the pillows, his breathing a shallow rasp. Something in the king's expression fractured. For one horrifying second, Edward thought his father would cry. Then Henry pulled himself up, his jaw setting. "Double the guards on this door. No one comes in without my permission." He faced the window, where the first evening stars appeared. "And get word to the archbishop. We will have prayers offered in every church in England." The unsaid instruction hung heavier than the medicinal odor. No one talks about this. As the king left, his steps echoing like drum beats, the physicians shared a look, their silence a clear answer. Edward closed his eyes. Beyond the palace, the country slept, blissfully unaware. The cough rattled in his chest a second heartbeat. This was different. The physicians spoke the word like a hex. Consumption. Edward's room had become a jail of incense and terror. The heavy curtains were kept drawn against the sun, as if daylight itself could make his illness worse. The air was thick with vinegar and burning herbs, futile guard against the sickness chewing at his lungs. Dr. Owens pressed his ear to the prince's back, hearing the wet, unsteady rasps under the skin. When he stood up, his face was somber. "The right lung is now afflicted," he said to his colleagues. "The corruption is spreading." Edward, propped on a pile of pillows, observed them with feverish eyes. He had heard enough of their quiet discussions to understand what it meant. The wasting sickness did not release its hold. It emptied a person drop by drop until only a fragile husk was left. "The king needs to be informed," said Dr. Fenton, though his voice was weak. "And tell him what?" retorted Dr. Butts, the youngest and least respected of the royal doctors. "That his heir is decaying from within." A silence descended, thick with the weight of that treason. They decided on euphemisms: a delicate constitution, a seasonal complaint, a humoral imbalance needing aggressive treatment. The cures became more frantic, more harsh. Edward suffered them all quietly. Leeches clung to his chest, their black forms swelling with his blood. Blistering plasters burned his skin, creating angry welts meant to pull out the sickness. The worst were the purges, awful draughts of mercury and crushed emeralds that left him writhing in pain, his insides twisting as if filled with daggers. "It will pass, Your Highness," whispered Lady Bryan, dabbing sweat from his brow after one such episode. Her hands were shaking. Edward said nothing. The taste of bile still lingered on his tongue. Outside his sick room, the court kept up its act. Ambassadors were told of the prince's excellent health. Official paintings showed a pink-cheeked boy, not the gaunt phantom haunting the royal suites. When Edward had to make an appearance, the royal tailor performed wonders, patting his doublets, adding color to his pale cheeks with berry juice stain. "Stand up straight," Henry ordered before one audience with the French delegation. The king's fingers dug into Edward's shoulder, holding him steady. "Smile." Edward complied, his lips cracking as they stretched. The envoy, naturally, saw nothing wrong, or was smart enough to act like it. "What a fine young prince," he exclaimed, bowing low. "England is truly blessed." Henry's laugh boomed through the chamber. A Tudor, through and through. That night, Edward coughed until his handkerchief was soaked scarlet. The physicians increased the mercury. By springtime, even the most potent remedies were failing. Edward's body gave up. His hair grew thin. His fingernails became as brittle as old parchment. The smell of decay followed him despite the servants' frantic washing with rose water and mint. "Perhaps a change of location," suggested Dr. Owens weakly. Henry, his patience gone, slammed a fist on the council table. "I did not hire you to offer perhaps." The physicians recoiled. They knew the destiny of those who disappointed the king. And so the treatments went on. The prince's arms became a mosaic of leech bites and needle marks. His once sharp mind grew hazy under the relentless assault of agony and drugs. Only at night, in the welcome quiet of his bedroom, did Edward let himself face the truth. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the irregular flutter under his ribs. "I am dying." Outside his window, the first fireflies of the summer danced above the palace gardens. Their small lights blinked, bright, brief, then gone. Edward watched them until his eyes stung. Then he buried his face in the pillow and coughed until the linen was red. The ulcers emerged overnight, inflamed, oozing sores that flowered across Edward's arms and chest like some hideous garden. By morning, the smell of decay had permeated the very walls of his room, a cloying sweetness under the vinegar and herbs. Lady Bryan gasped when she pulled back the covers. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered, making the sign of the cross. Edward barely moved. His skin had a sallow color, stretched thin over bones that seemed to get sharper each hour. The fever hadn't subsided in weeks, and now his breath came in shallow, rattling gasps, each one tinged with the metallic flavor of blood. Dr. Owens arrived first, his typical confidence faltering at the sight. He touched one of the sores with a silver probe, and Edward whimpered, his eyelids fluttering. A thick, yellowish liquid seeped from the wound. "This is no simple humoral imbalance," the physician said, wiping his tool on a cloth already stained with similar fluids. "Then what is it?" Lady Bryan asked, her voice shaking. Dr. Owens paused. The reality that the prince's body was eating itself was treason to say aloud. Instead, he grabbed his satchel. We must remove the corruption. Leeches, possibly, or a poultice of egg white and sulfur. Edward turned his head away, too tired to object. He had gone through this ritual 100 times. The leeches would attach to his skin, the poultices would burn his flesh, and nothing would be different. The rot was inside him, deep and relentless. By noon, the whole Privy Council had been notified. They stood in quiet groups outside the sick room, their faces troubled with the unasked question, what happens when he dies? Henry came like a thunderclap, his presence scattering the whispers. He strode to the bed, his nostrils flaring at the odor, but his eyes never left his son. Edward, he commanded, as if his sheer will could wake him. The prince's eyelids lifted slightly. His lips moved, but no words came out. A small trickle of blood ran from the corner of his mouth. The king's jaw set. He turned on the physicians. Why is he getting worse? Dr. Fenton stepped forward, his robes smelling of myrrh. His humors are deeply disturbed, Your Majesty. Mars and Saturn are in alignment. Enough. Henry's roar made a servant stumble backward. I want cures, not astrological nonsense. The physicians shared a look. Then, like men with no other choices, they suggested the unthinkable, a tonic of crushed pearls and mercury, potent enough to purge even the most resilient corruption. Henry gave a sharp nod. Do it. Edward hardly felt the hands lifting him, the cold edge of the cup on his lips. The draught burned like a fire, searing his throat, his stomach, his very blood. He convulsed, a ragged sound tearing from his chest. But the physicians held him down. It must run its course, Dr. Owens said, though his voice was unconvincing. The pain was excruciating. Edward's sight blurred, his arms and legs flailing against the bedclothes. Somewhere past the agony, he heard Lady Bryan crying. And then, mercifully, the blackness consumed him. When he awoke, the room was silent, except for the crackling fire. The ulcers still festered, the smell still lingered, but the king had left. Edward closed his eyes. The truth came to him, cold and definite. No potion could help him now. The physician's anxiety curdled into something cruel. Every morning Edward was bled. Not the delicate punctures from before, but deep, rough cuts that left his arms striped in crimson. The bowl by his bed filled far too quickly, its contents as dark as red wine. The leeches, now fat and slow from their feasts, were swapped for fresh ones, their tiny mouths fastening onto unbroken skin. The humors have to be balanced, Dr. Fenton intoned, as if reading from a holy book. His fingers, slippery with Edward's blood, tightened the tourniquet on the prince's elbow. The black bile is dominant. Edward did not make sound. His voice had long since failed him, worn out by coughing and silence. He stared at the ceiling, counting the fissures in the plaster as the lancet cut into his skin. 1, 2, 3. The pain was a far-off thing now, softened by layers of fever and fatigue. The purges were more terrible. They poured draughts of white hellebore down his throat, a poison designed to scour his insides. Within moments, Edward's body would convulse, ejecting everything, food, bile, blood, until he was just retching air. The physicians nodded, mistaking his agony for improvement. See how the corruption is leaving him, Dr. Owens said, putting a hand on Edward's heaving back. Lady Bryan turned away, her face pale. She had cared for 3 generations of tutors, had seen babies thrive and perish in her charge. But this was butchery posing as medicine. At night, when the doctors went to their rooms to discuss new hypotheses, she dared to press a cool cloth to Edward's forehead. His skin felt like hot coals. "They're killing you," she whispered, so quietly the words were barely audible. Edward's lips parted, but nothing came out. His eyes, though wide and feverish with pain, said everything. I know. The court, naturally, was blind to this. Official reports mentioned a minor indisposition, of a prince recovering with expected strength, The king's advisors repeated the fabrication with practiced smiles, their eyes avoiding the truth like water from oiled cloth. Only once did the mask slip. The Spanish ambassador, a clever man with a network of informants, bribed a laundress for the prince's bed linens. The fabric, stiff with blood and pus, spoke for itself. "He will not survive the summer," the ambassador wrote in a coded message. The note never got to Spain. Henry's spies caught it, and the laundress disappeared into the tower's dungeons. But the rumors spread nonetheless, slithering through the palace like venom. The prince is rotting alive. The Tudor line is ending with him. Henry's reaction was swift and vicious. 3 courtiers were executed for treasonous talk. The physicians were ordered to redouble their work. And Edward endured. He drank the mercury-laced soups that made his teeth ache. He lay quietly as the blistering poultices ate at his skin. He coughed blood into silk handkerchiefs that were quickly incinerated. Through it all, he maintained his role, the beautiful prince, the stoic heir. Even as his body failed him, even as the rot dug deeper, he gave them no satisfaction of his pain. Only in the quietest hours, when the room was empty save for the flickering candlelight, did he let himself shake. He would press a hand to his ribs, feeling the unsteady flutter beneath, and wonder which breath would be his last. Outside his window, the world continued. The sun came up and went down, the gardens bloomed. The kingdom, unaware, awaited its golden future. And Edward, wrapped in the smell of his own decay, counted the cracks on the ceiling. 1, 2, 3. The order came at dawn. Edward's staff descended on his room like a flock of ravens, their hands busy with false optimism. They clothed him in layers of padded silk, a child's defense against prying glances, and colored his hollow cheeks with crushed madder root until the hue bloomed unnaturally bright. "The king requests your presence in the great hall," whispered the groom of the stool, avoiding Edward's sunken eyes as he secured the jeweled collar at his neck. The prince was silent. His strength, what little he had left, was saved for the enormous effort of remaining upright. The fever had subsided for the first time in weeks, leaving him drained and shivering, his body a map of sores and scars. But the king's command was absolute. They helped him from the bed, his legs giving way instantly. A page caught him under the arms, his grasp tightening as Edward wobbled. "Steady, Your Highness," the boy whispered, his voice shaky with fear. The journey to the great hall was an ordeal of slow, careful steps. Every breath rattled in Edward's chest, each one threatening to become a cough. The halls, normally filled with courtiers, were empty, no one to witness the prince's weakness. Only the tapestries observed his passage, their woven monarchs and saints looking down with silent pity. At the doors, Henry was waiting. The king was magnificent in cloth of gold, his size blocking the light from the hall behind him. For a second, his eyes moved over his son, the frail wrists, the quivering jaw, and something like sorrow twisted his face. Then it vanished, concealed beneath the usual mask of authority. "Straighten your shoulders," Henry commanded, taking Edward's arm. "The French delegation needs to see England's power." Edward nodded, swallowing the metallic flavor in his mouth. He knew the routine. Smile. Nod. Do not cough. The doors swung wide. A rush of heat and sound hit them. The smell of perfumed nobles, the sparkle of 100 candles. The hall was filled with courtiers and envoys, all craning their necks for a look at the prince whose absence had sparked rumors across Europe. Edward moved forward, his legs shaking beneath him. For a moment, the deception worked. The padding in his doublet hid his wasted frame. The rouge covered his pallor. The gems at his throat captured the light, pulling eyes away from the shadows under his own. Then the coughing began. It started as a tickle, a slight tightness in his chest. Edward clenched his jaw, tried to will it away, but the irritation grew, spreading like wildfire, until his body shook with its force. The sound was wet and rough, cutting through the hall's appreciative murmurs. A shocked silence descended. Blood sprayed onto Edward's hand, as bright as jewels against his pale skin. Gasps went through the crowd. The French ambassador stepped back, his cup falling from his grasp to clatter on the floor. Henry moved quickly, his form hiding Edward from sight. "My son is overwhelmed with joy at your presence," he boomed, forcing a laugh. He put a hand on Edward's shoulder, his fingers digging in like claws. A tutor's passion is not easily restrained. The courtiers recovered, their applause a fraction too late, too enthusiastic. But their eyes betrayed them, glancing at the crimson marks on Edward's sleeve, the way his breath hitched between each strained smile. The ambassador bowed, his expression carefully blank. "Indeed, your majesty." A most energetic prince. Edward stood there, frozen, his vision blurring. The hall seemed to spin around him, the faces merging into a single, ugly mask of pity and speculation. They all saw it now, the truth they had been told not to speak. England's golden heir was dying. Henry's grip tightened, pulling him up. "To your rooms," he hissed through clenched teeth. Now, as the servants rushed to lead him away, Edward got a final look at the court. The whispers already starting behind their hands, the quick departures of those eager to share the news. Behind him, the king's laughter rang out again, too loud, too empty. And Edward, shuffling back to his prison of silk and shadows, finally understood. He was no longer a son. He was a performance. The collapse happened without fanfare. One moment Edward was in the courtyard, blinking in the weak winter sun as his staff discussed if he was strong enough for a short walk. The next, his legs gave out and the world went sideways. He didn't feel the hard cobblestones, only the hands, dozens of them, lifting him, their grips tight and painful. Voices overlapped in a chorus of alarm. "Get the king. Summon the physicians. God save the prince." Edward drifted between consciousness and oblivion, catching bits of the chaos. The jarring movement of the litter taking him back to his rooms, the smell of nervous sweat under the servants' perfumes, the distant sound of a bell. Whether for celebration or grief, he couldn't say. When he was fully awake, he saw the familiar ceiling of his bedroom, its cracks like rivers on the plaster. But the room was different now. The windows were sealed shut, keeping out even the faintest light. The air was thick with the cloying sweetness of rot, barely hidden by incense. And the bed, once a symbol of royal comfort, was an island of pain, its sheets marked with blood and sweat. "Water!" Edward managed, his tongue dry. A cup was brought to his lips, but the liquid was not water. The bitter taste of medicine made him gag, but the physician's hold was firm. "Drink, your highness. It will make you stronger." Edward did, though he knew it was a lie. Nothing made him stronger anymore. Each dose just hollowed him out more, leaving him weak and shaking. As the potion took hold, the room came into sharper view. The physicians were gathered by the fire, their whispers audible despite their efforts. "The lungs are almost entirely consumed. The ulcers are spreading inward." Lady Bryan sat by the bed, her needlework forgotten in her lap. Her eyes were swollen, her usual calm gone. When she saw Edward watching, she forced a smile. "The king has called for prayers in every parish," she said, her voice too cheerful. "The whole country is praying for your health." Edward looked away. He had heard such empty words before. Prayers hadn't stopped the sores from appearing on his skin. They wouldn't unrot his lungs. A new figure entered the room, Dr. Fenton, carrying a silver platter loaded with fresh leeches. Their dark bodies shone in the firelight, already squirming with anticipation. Edward shut his eyes. The procedure was quick and systematic. Cold hands rolled up his sleeves, showing the mottled skin of his arms. The leeches were placed with care, their small mouths finding the least damaged areas they could. Edward didn't move. After months of this, the sensation was almost routine. The first pinch, the slow crawl as they fed. "Excellent," Dr. Fenton noted, recording the leech's rapid swelling in his book. "The corrupted blood is draining." Edward was silent. He watched as one of the creatures detached too soon, its full body falling onto the sheets with a wet sound. It writhed for a moment, then stopped. "Even they can't stomach me," he thought, a mad laugh bubbling in his chest. It came out as a cough, spattering the pillow with red. The physicians shared a look. That night, the fever returned with a fury. Edward thrashed under the blankets, his skin burning one moment, freezing the next. Images flickered at the edge of his mind. His mother's face, pale in death. His father's immense rage. The throne, its gilded edges hazy, as if underwater. "Make it stop," he pleaded, though he no longer knew to whom he was speaking. God, the physicians, the illness itself. No one replied. The servants changed the bedding twice before morning, each time removing linen stiff with sweat and blood. Edward drifted in the quiet moments, his mind free from time. Once he thought he heard Mary's voice at the door, demanding to come in. The guard denied her. By morning, the reality was clear. The prince's arms, once just thin, were now skeletal, the bones pushing against the skin like sticks in parchment. The sores had reached his neck, their yellow rims stark against his pallor. And the smell. Not even the strongest incense could hide it now. The physician's reports to the king became vague, their words shrouded in euphemism, but their eyes, when they thought no one was watching, held the same grim knowledge. Edward saw it, understood it. As another coughing fit shook his body, he saw his reflection in the polished surface of a water bowl. A hollow-eyed stranger, more spirit than child. The face of a king who would never rule. The pain had long moved beyond the point of words. It was part of Edward now, a second heartbeat, a shadow self that chewed at his bones and filled his lungs with liquid fire. The physician's work became a nonstop cycle of torture. The burning poultices, the needles stabbing his skin, the leeches feeding until they burst. He no longer screamed. His voice had failed him, leaving only whimpers that disappeared into the heavy air of his room. The sores had won. They marched across his body, festering and weeping, digging deeper as if seeking the last pure parts of him. The smell of rot clung to it all, the bedclothes, the rushes on the floor, the hands of the servants who turned him like a slab of meat. Lady Bryan no longer pretended. She cried openly as she wiped at the ulcers with vinegar-soaked cloths, her tears mixing with the pus. "My prince," she whispered, as if the title alone could heal him. Edward stared past her, his eyes fixed on the canopy above. The embroidered Tudor roses there, once bright, now seemed to droop in the dim light. He thought of the gardens outside, of how the real roses had smelled last summer, sweet and vibrant, nothing like his own decay. A disturbance at the door broke the tense silence. "Out of my way," Henry's voice, booming even through the fever's haze. The guards moved aside, and the king filled the entrance, his sighs blocking the light from the hall. For a second, father and son just stared at each other. Henry's face, usually red with rage or wine, was pale. His eyes moved over Edward's ruined form, the shock in them raw and clear. Then the mask fell back into place. "This is an unfit state for a prince," Henry snarled, turning on the physicians. "Where are your potions, your cures?" Dr. Owen stepped forward, his hands shaking like trapped birds. "Your Majesty, we have tried every tried." The king grabbed the physician's collar, pulling him up until their faces were inches apart. "That boy is the future of this kingdom. You will not stop until he is recovered." Edward watched the scene as if from a great distance. He wanted to laugh or cry. Even now, with death in the corners of the room, his father couldn't speak the truth. Henry pushed Dr. Owens away and turned back to the bed. His hand hovered over Edward's brow, as if scared to touch what might break at the slightest contact. "You will recover," he said, the command weakening at the edges. "Tudors do not surrender." Edward's lips parted. A bubble of blood formed and burst. The king drew back as if burned. Silence grew between them, filled with all the words they could never say. Then Henry straightened, his rings flashing as he gestured to the staff. "Burn more incense, and bring the archbishop. My son will receive the last rites." The words sent a shock through the room. Last rites were for the dying. Henry saw their reaction and bared his teeth. "A precaution," he snapped, but his voice was unconvincing. As the servants rushed to follow, the king leaned down, his breath hot and sour with wine against Edward's ear. "Do not bring me shame," he whispered. Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the hall like a fading storm. Edward closed his eyes. The pain was everywhere now, a living thing eating through his flesh. But under it, under the fear and the loneliness, a strange calm settled over him. The pretense was done. Somewhere beyond the closed windows, birds were singing in the palace gardens. The sound was faint, almost imagined. Edward held on to it, letting it take him away from the stench, from the whispers, from the weight of the crown he would never wear. The candles sputtered, shadows danced on the walls, and Edward, at last, stopped struggling. The palace held its breath. Edward's room had become a tomb, thick with the smell of beeswax and rot. The physicians no longer tried to treat him, but just lingered at the edges, their hands clasped like mourners at a wake. The king's final order was direct: keep him alive until the succession is settled. But even Henry's command could not stop the inevitable. Lady Bryan stayed watch by the bed. Her needlework lay abandoned in her lap. The half-finished Tudor rose lay forgotten, its threads as broken as her spirit. She wiped Edward's forehead with a damp cloth, though the fever had long given way to a strange coldness. His skin was like parchment stretched over bones that seemed to get sharper by the hour. "The Archbishop has arrived," whispered a servant from the doorway. Cranmer came in, his robes rustling against the floor, the scent of holy oil mixing with the sickroom's odor as he neared the bed. Edward's eyes fluttered open, two dull blue shards in a face that was already a ghost's. "Your Highness," Cranmer said gently, leaning close. "I have come to pray for you." Edward's lips moved, but no sound came out. A thin line of blood seeped from the corner of his mouth. Lady Bryan wiped it away with a shaking hand. The Archbishop started the rites, his voice even despite the grief in his throat. The Latin words wrapped around the room like a burial shroud. Edward's fingers moved in response, as if reaching for the words. Outside the chamber, the court buzzed with quiet frenzy. Couriers moved through shadowed halls, their messages coded and vital. The Duke of Northumberland held secret councils, his voice low and firm. The Lady Jane must be ready. Mary, kept from her brother's room by the king's order, knelt in her own chapel, her rosary beads clicking like a death watch beetle. She prayed for Edward's soul and her own triumph. If he passes, the throne is mine by law. Elizabeth, always careful, focused on her studies, her face a mask of serenity. But her quill paused over the page, letting ink pool like blood. She had learned early that survival required silence. Back in the sickroom, Cranmer anointed Edward's forehead with oil, making the sign of the cross. The prince's breath hitched, a wet, rattling sound that filled the quiet between prayers. Lady Bryan choked back a sob. "It will not be much longer," whispered Dr. Owens to his colleagues. They nodded, their faces somber. The truth was a living presence in the room, pulsing under every prayer, every muffled gasp. Edward's eyes drifted to the window, where a sliver of dusk bled through the shutters. Somewhere outside, the first stars appeared in the sky. His lips moved again, forming a word, or maybe just a breath. "Free." The candles flickered, the shadows grew deeper, and the court, balanced on the knife edge of chaos and order, waited. The seizure started at midnight. Edward's body arched from the mattress, his spine bowing like a drawn bow. His fingers clawed at the bedclothes, twisting the fine linen into knots as his limbs fought against an unseen enemy. A guttural sound ripped from his throat, half scream, half gasp, as his lungs struggled for air they could no longer take in. Lady Bryan drew back, her hands pressed to her mouth. "Sweet Jesus, help him!" The physicians rushed forward, their cures now useless, but their actions frantic. Dr. Finnan put a wooden spoon between Edward's teeth to stop him from biting through his tongue. Dr. Owens poured another dose of poppy syrup down his throat, though more of it spilled than was swallowed. The prince's body was rejecting everything now, writhing beyond the control of their potions and prayers. Edward's eyes rolled back, showing only the whites. Froth collected at the corners of his mouth, tinged pink with blood. His breath came in short, wet gasps, each one a losing battle. The disease had triumphed. It filled his chest, drowning him from the inside. The archbishop's prayers became louder, desperate to be heard over the death rattle. Libera me, Domini, but there would be no liberation, only this suffering. Edward's heels beat against the mattress, his body convulsing so hard the bed frame rattled. The ulcers had now burst, weeping pus that stained the linens yellow. The smell was overpowering, a reek of rotting flesh and spoiled medicine that made even the jaded physicians gag. Somewhere beyond the horror, a clock struck 1-2. On the third chime, Edward became still. For one awful second, the room held its breath. The prince's chest rose once, twice, then fell for the last time. His mouth went slack, his fingers uncurled. And just like that, England's golden prince was no more. The silence that came after was thicker than the stench. The physicians shared a look, their hands hovering uselessly over the body. Lady Bryan sank into a chair, her sobs lost in her apron. Cranmer made the sign of the cross. In paradisum dejecant te angeli, but there was no paradise here, only the brutal reality of a body undone. Edward's form, once prepared for kingship, lay savaged and twisted, his face set in a mask of agony. No poet would sing of this end. No artist would capture this moment. History would recall a boy, king taken by God, not the animal pain of his passing. The door flew open. Henry stood there, his face ashen. He saw the scene, the blood, the smell, the still figure on the bed, and something inside him broke. No, the word was a plea, a denial, a command. No one replied. The king stumbled forward, his large frame suddenly unstable. He reached for his son, then pulled back at the touch of cooling skin. His hands, which had held swords and signed execution orders, trembled over Edward's ruined face. "You were meant to be strong," he whispered. But the boy who had spent his life trying to meet that expectation could not hear him. Somewhere in the palace, a servant began to cry. The sound slid through the halls, growing louder as it spread. Soon it would reach the streets, then the kingdom, then the world. But in that first raw moment, there was only the corpse on the bed, the smell of failure, and the deafening silence where a dynasty's future had been. Henry turned away. Behind him, the physicians started their work of preparing the body, washing away the blood, the sweat, the proof of agony. They would anoint him with spices, dress him in gold cloth, and show him to the court as if he had simply drifted off to sleep. The lie was already forming, and Edward, freed at last from the weight of crowns and expectations, lay beyond all caring. The bells tolled throughout London, their sad peals echoing through streets hung with black. The nation grieved, or feigned grief. In the great cathedrals, priests praised Edward's piety and potential. In the taverns, men drank to the prince's name, their voices quieted with the gravity of the loss. But behind closed doors, in the hushed corners of the court and the dark alleys of the city, another sound was whispered beneath the sorrow: relief. The official announcement had been careful with its words. A sudden malady, a peaceful end, a prince called too soon to God's side, no mention of the months of pain, the smell of rot, the boy who had decayed alive in the royal bedroom. History would remember Edward as the golden successor, not the wasted form convulsing in his own sickness. Lady Bryan placed the prince's final handkerchief, stiff with dried blood, into a cedar box, her actions precise. The servants had already incinerated the fouled linens, scrubbed the floors with lye, and aired out the room until no hint of illness was left. Even the physician's notes had been altered, their grim details replaced with vague statements about a tragic constitutional weakness. "It was the Lord's will," said the Duke of Northumberland to the council, though his eyes shone with ambition. The succession was a chessboard, and he was already positioning his pieces. Mary locked herself in her chapel, her prayers filled with righteous anger. "They kept me from his final hours," she thought, her fingers clenching her rosary. "But they cannot deny me my birthright." Elizabeth, ever vigilant, wore a mask of sadness. Yet her mind was racing, assessing risks, gauging loyalties. A kingdom without Edward was a kingdom on a knife's edge. Only Henry seemed untouched by the undercurrents of ambition. The king had secluded himself in his private study, surrounded by paintings of his son, all showing him in health, all of them lies. He drank until the images blurred, until he could almost convince himself the boy in the next chamber was just asleep. But the truth remained, thick as the incense they burned to hide it. In the streets, the people mourned as they were instructed to mourn. They hung black cloth on their doors, whispered prayer for the prince's soul, and spoke of omens. The comet spotted the week before he died, the fox that had darted through Westminster Abbey at midnight. Yet under the formal grief, fear spread like ink on paper. With Edward gone, the Tudor line was hanging by a thread. The specter of civil war appeared, its cold breath on the back of England's neck. And in the silent gaps between the bells, between the sobs and the homilies, the truth festered. A boy had died in agony. A kingdom was on the brink. And the silence that followed was the most deafening noise of all. The throne room was empty, its gilded seat a hollow tribute to what could have been. Edward's death left a wound that would not close. The kingdom, so carefully held together by Henry's iron fist, started to unravel at the seams. The counselors, who had once bowed before the boy king, now watched each other with cautious suspicion, their allegiances shifting like sand. Mary was the first to assert her claim. By right of blood and of law, the crown belongs to me, she announced, her voice echoing through the council chamber. The Spanish ambassador stood by her side, a silent assurance of imperial support. Her fingers shook, not from fear but from conviction. This was her moment, her divine destiny. Northumberland's smile was thin as paper. Your Grace, you misunderstand the late king's testament. He unfurled the document with a dramatic gesture, its seal still bright. The Lady Jane Grey is the named heir. Gasps went through the room. Jane, a Protestant cousin of royal lineage, pale and shaking in her borrowed clothes, looked as if she might collapse. Elizabeth, standing aside, said nothing. Her eyes moved between the actors. Mary's furious righteousness, Northumberland's cold ambition, Jane's quiet fear, and saw the future playing out like a disaster. The people made their choice quickly. London streets erupted at the news of Jane's ascension. Long live Queen Mary, they shouted, their Catholic passion overflowing after years of being suppressed. The Lady Jane's rule lasted 9 days. A brief shadow on the throne before a wave of rebellion sent her to the Tower. Mary rode into the city in triumph, her flags flying, but the applause concealed a deeper worry. The kingdom was divided, its religious wounds torn open. The burning started within a year. Heretics, reformers, anyone who challenged the old faith. The smoke of their martyrdom drifted over Smithfield, and the people whispered that Bloody Mary had truly earned her name. Elizabeth, always a survivor, bent like a reed in the wind. She went to Mass, wore her rosary with fake devotion, and kept her real opinions locked behind a smile. But the Tower's shadow was large in her nightmares. You are your mother's child, Mary spat during one tense meeting, her eyes burning with mistrust. Elizabeth curtsied low, her voice sweet. I'm England's child, sister. Nothing else, the lie saved her. By the time Mary's own sickness took hold, a cancer, it was said, or a heart broken by sorrow, the kingdom was weary. The Spanish marriage had produced no heir, only the threat of foreign control. The fields were unplowed, the treasury emptied by conflict and excess. Elizabeth, when her moment arrived, inherited a shattered realm. She stood before her first parliament, her red hair shining beneath the crown, and talked of unity. But the ghosts remained. Edward's wasted potential, Mary's bloody fanaticism, the endless what-ifs that plagued the Tudor line. We are united, she declared, by God's command and England's need. Yet, as the court applauded, the old advisers shared a look. They recalled the golden prince who had coughed his life away, the dynasty that had depended on one frail boy, and they wondered. Outside the palace, the people lit bonfires for their new queen. But the flames threw long shadows, reaching back to a quiet sick room and a crown that had turned to dust. England survived. The Tudors did not. Centuries later, Academics would study the incomplete records of Edward VI's reign, assembling the truth from between the lines of courtly deceptions. The official accounts described a devout prince, a scholar king taken too early by a divine act. But the private letters, the physician's notes smuggled from the palace, told a different tale, one of extended agony, of a child tortured by the very men tasked with healing him. In the quiet halls of universities, the reevaluation started. Dr. Eleanor Hartwell, a medical historian, followed the course of Edward's illness through the coded notes of Dr. Owens. The mercury cures alone would have been fatal, she stated in her seminal work. They poisoned him gradually, hiding the tuberculosis until it was beyond help. The Tudor propaganda machine had been too effective. Edward's pain had been sanitized, his death recast as a noble sacrifice. Even the paintings were lies, depicting a rosy-cheeked youth, not the skeletal form described in Lady Bryan's personal letters. Medical journals analyzed the uselessness of 16th-century cures, the leeches, the purges, the mercury that destroyed Edward's organs even as it was supposed to save him. And the public, faced with the stark truth, was appalled. The Tudors were monsters, a popular documentary claimed, contrasting Henry's gilded paintings with the grim reality of his son's sickbed. But the greater horror was in knowing that Edward's destiny was not exceptional. Countless others, unnamed and forgotten, had suffered the same in an era when medicine was as much superstition as it was science. Edward's tragedy was simply the one important enough to record, and even then, only in whispers. Historians argued the wider consequences. If Edward had lived, would England have escaped the religious chaos of Mary's reign? Would the Tudor dynasty have continued? The questions were infinite, the answers forever gone. Yet amidst the academic debate, one truth was unshakable. Edward VI's death was not the serene passing of myth. It was a slow, painful unraveling, a boy screaming into a void while the court outside his chamber played at normalcy. In the end, the forgotten agony was remembered, and Henry VIII's cruel legacy received one more footnote of infamy.